Well, today, folks, welcome. I'm pleased to have with me a colleague and friend, Connie Carter, Dr. Connie Carter. Connie's a member of our faculty here at Royal Roads in the Business School, but interestingly, she's also an adjunct faculty member at UVic, at Grenoble Graduate School of Business, and as well, she's a barrister from the Lincoln Inn in London. She got her degrees in London, and most of us would know as a lawyer as well that the Lincoln Inn is very prestigious. So we're pleased to have Connie with us today. She has published a number of publications, but the one that caught my interest was this one called Special Economic Zones in Asian Market Economies, edited by Connie, but she has some wonderful articles in there, and there's a copy on reserve down in our library. So you're welcome to have a look at it. But it's something important that as business practitioners, those involved in international business, and I say to you that I don't think of a business today that's not somehow involved in international business, should be aware of these economic zones and the advantages they offer for some organizations. Are they good or bad? And we're going to spend a few moments on that today as well. So Connie, the first question I have for you today is, what are special economic zones?
Well, that's a very good question to start off with. But you know, there isn't really one accepted definition. I'll give you two. And the first one I'll give you is probably the one that is actually the working model in China, which, as you know, that's the area I've studied an awful lot. So special economic zone, certainly the Chinese special economic zones, are geographically defined areas which have been set up by the government where they give incentives to different companies, usually foreign companies, to do FDI. So they must bring in some foreign direct investment, and they must also promise to export the products that they've manufactured in the zone, and also that they'll be creating jobs and transferring technology, transferring skills. That's the basic model. And that is the good definition of it. The reason I'm saying there's no set definition is that people call them different things as well. So some of them have been called export processing zones, EPZs. Some people call them just industrial parks or science parks. There are lots of different names. But one of the important distinctions in a different definition that I would give you is that they're not always special geographic areas. They're no longer. Maybe 5 years ago, all of them were in every country. But nowadays, people have decided that they could actually just name an industry.
Wow.
Or even a specific company could get the designation. In other words, they could get those incentives that they were offering. And mainly it would be financial incentives, tax breaks and so on. But those could be given to individual companies even if they're not within the zone.
That brings me to my second question. What needs, and I guess you probably touched upon that, what needs do these things perform? And I guess what you're saying is location economies.
Yes, essentially. So countries, and mainly they're developing countries, although there are special economic zones in developed countries as well. But if we look at developing countries, essentially what they've used them for is to kickstart their economic development. And if they have already got some development going, which certainly China didn't when they started in 1979, but if we're countries that have already started some, they really use it to enhance their economic development. So that's one need that they're doing. The other is that many countries use them as incubators or just laboratories for experimenting, for instance, in law reform or in different models of economic development. They also use them to help, well, essentially the main point, I guess, is poverty alleviation. So they're really saying by creating jobs and by ensuring that we upgrade the economy, that in itself is part of alleviating poverty within a country. They also use special economic zones to trigger that whole investment in their infrastructure. Because essentially, if the infrastructure isn't working, then they know the foreign companies won't come. Yep. So essentially, we're looking at things like electricity, water, transportation, so the airports. And interestingly enough, most of the special economic zones are based by big ports. Because again, once you've done your manufacturing, you want to get the products to market.
And China, the southeast coast, gets a lot of these.
All of the initial ones, the first one was set up in Shenzhen, just opposite Hong Kong.
Just outside Hong Kong.
And that was, it was born in 79, but essentially got going in 1980. And that's along the coast. The next one was in Xiamen, which is Fujian province. That's just opposite Taiwan.
Yeah.
Right, and then we've got Guangzhou, Shantou. All of them were just on the coast, the southeast coast of China. And apparently one of the reasons was that if they didn't work, because they were experiments after all, if they didn't work, the leadership at that time felt they could close them down and nobody inside of China would ever really know that they happened. And don't forget, we're looking at places that in Fujian, the one in Xiamen used to be called Amoy, and certainly Guangzhou was Canton. So these are old sort of port cities where they used to be used anyway as part of that whole system of the treaty ports.
I had a client back in about 1980, just when it first opened up in Shenzhen. It was one of the first ones there, just across from Hong Kong. And I was struck at that time, and I guess I'm going to talk about that, but I want to read the title of one of your chapters you put together in the book here, caught my eye. Policy Incubators or Catalyst for Development. Policy Incubators or Catalyst for Development. I want to come back to that for a few minutes because you touched upon the incubator side of it, but I want to talk about that. But back to just digress for a moment, for my client using those for the first time, he wanted to import Chinese products because the bamboo curtain comes down in 1978, and all of a sudden China gets into the game, and he wanted to be a first mover advantage to bring some product into North America and use Canada because of NAFTA as a conduit to get into America. So the logic was there, and we had some wonderful conversations back and forth. But one of the things he wanted to bring in was some cups and saucers and things of that nature, low-tech sort of stuff. And we're chatting back and forth, and he said, Terry, there's no problem doing it, but make sure when you send them the model, because they'll replicate anything. And China's known for replicating an Apple computer or whatever. In those days, give them a cup and they'll replicate it. But he says, be careful when you give them the cup that there's a crack in it. Make sure there's no cracks, because every cup will come out with a identical crack in it. And so I was struck by that. But more importantly, with the time with this center, and this is what comes to the heading of your chapter, I said, well, using a North American mental model about price points and that, I said, well, what price can you bring them in landed cost for? He says, Terry, it doesn't matter. He said the government simply wants to use it as a tool to capture a foothold in the North American market. So slave labor, whatever dollars are required, the Chinese government will throw it at it in order to get market share in America. So then, Connie, I come back to you with the question on your chapter there. Would the heading be better policy incubators? And I made a note here, rather than catalyst for development, but really it's or strategic marketing warfare. Would that be a better title for that chapter? What do you think about that? Am I off the mark?
I don't know. I think in the beginning it wasn't so much about market warfare as actually connecting with the global economy. Because don't forget that right at the beginning, China, as a communist country and as a very isolated country, they really just wanted to open up to the world. And that was also what Deng Xiaoping said in 1978, when all these laws were passed, etc. And this was December of 78. So essentially, I remind people that it's really from 79 that it got going. But they were just interested in having contact with the world again. Opening up is what the policy was called. And then they introduced an awful lot of reforms that went with that, legal reforms. But essentially, that you can draw a direct line between the SEZ's opening up in 1979-80, in the 80s, to China entering the WTO. Because essentially they really used it as a sort of leverage for getting in to the global economy to determine the terms on which they would enter the WTO.
Because certainly it gave them a competitive advantage if they have $2 a day labor and slave labor and low impact on on trade and patents and those sort of laws, it's an unfair advantage, isn't it, to get that market toehold? And so for me, I still come back to the idea that strategic marketing warfare, from the perspective of a North America, of a developed country, we're being attacked. And we're losing market share, we're losing jobs offshore because of these.
Well, I hear what you say, and I can see where you're coming from, but I think if you see where was China coming from, I'm sure at that stage it wasn't as explicit as you're saying, because they really, if you look at the trade that was happening then, it was nearly all, there was one trading company in Hamburg, and that almost served all of Europe, exporting anything to China. They didn't even have a contract law. You know, and so they're coming from a very basic level, and I think the sophistication of what you're saying was not part of the equation at the time.
Fair point.
I can see how you would say in 1990s and certainly now in the 21st century, that's what's happening.
And it may be unfair. I mean, you point out correctly. I mean, it's taken us in North America since the 1640s to get to where we are today on sort of an exponential curve to get up to our expectations of human rights and all those standards today. And then China has only been since 1979 that we say, okay, from 1640 standards, we want you up here to our standards in 30 years. So maybe our expectations are a little high. So.
Well, I think especially with regard to intellectual property, you touched on that yourself, and as you know, that's the area of law I practiced. But that is still, what has happened in China is that the laws on paper are perfect. I mean, there isn't one that you could look at, well, except maybe in labor law, but all of their commercial laws and things like intellectual property were brought up to date in order to comply with their entry into the World Trade Organization. And that happened in 2001. But the problem is still implementation.
The legal system's still under government there, so government says how to implement it.
And they don't know the whole concept of the rule of law, for instance, that in China we say it's ruled by law, which isn't the same as of law.
There's a good movie with Richard Gere, I'm trying to recall, was it Red Corners? Or
I don't know that.
It showed the the North American one is in To Kill a Mockingbird. It showed the rule of law, but the counterfoil for that is the a Chinese movie with Richard Gere almost 20 years ago now. But he's still a strong proponent on Chinese human rights. But it was called, I think, Red Corners, and it showed he got tangled up with the judicial system there, and was quite an eye opener for him in the film. How the Chinese system worked, notwithstanding what it said on paper, how it could be interpreted and how government could intercede and direct judges as to how the interpretation would take place. So anybody going offshore would be wise, as Connie points out, to understand the legal systems offshore, and they may not be just taken on face value as we do with here for statistics and law and things of that nature. Connie, I've noticed in my readings here there's been a proliferation in these economic zones globally. I did read back the World Trade Organization in 1995 published a report kind of pessimistic about the future of that. What's your sense? They're working?
I'm not sure that pessimism is the right word, with all due respect. What their report was arguing was that some of the incentives that were being offered were actually breaching the idea of free trade. And there is specifically that there's the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures, which, as you know, is one of the covered agreements under the WTO. And that specifically prohibits what they call, I wrote down something here, with trade distorting measures, right? And a trade distorting measure would be, for instance, what they used in China a lot was to say, okay, bring your company here, set it up here, we'll give you these subsidies, i.e., you know, tax breaks and things like that. But it would be based on your performance of how many products you were exporting. Or they would say, but you must buy local content. So of the products you're manufacturing here in our zone, so many of them had to be locally sourced. And that is against the WTO rules under that agreement about
and it supports
subsidies.
the notion of them going, we say they're going to to a free market system, but clearly they're not. They're just moving towards it.
Yeah.
But everything you said there strikes me still as strong elements of a command economy as to how many you'll produce and things like that.
How many you'll export. Well,
Yeah.
all of them should be exported,
Yeah,
but
so-
they'd say if your export quota was so high, then we would give you more money, or you would get this extra money, training, etc. And so that's what the WTO said already then, that those were prohibited because they would be considered trade distorting.
Okay.
And China hasn't really taken much note of that.
I'm a believer. I'm
Not yet.
sold. I believe now in economic zones. I see in your book India and Asia and Malaysia have all got these things
South
unfolding
Korea.
and all taking advantage of it and all getting that competitive advantage, those location economies exporting them, and they're capturing global market shares. I'm a believer. Canada, what do we do? Do we have any of these?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't think there are. Terry, I wondered about it, but it's not my research area, so I haven't looked at it seriously. I think I will, because I see no reason why Canada hasn't got any, except perhaps the fact that Canada still persists in that the favourite paradigm is, you know, as hewers of wood and drawers of water, and then we can send it all down to America. It's easier.
We sell our commodities. I know in Canada, like the Vancouver International Airport at one point, we did put together their incubator areas where they could bring materials in coming into North America and no tax, providing they stay within the hangar building, do the value added, and then reship it.
Yes.
We at least went that far down the road.
Okay.
But
And they call those free trade zones, so lots of airports do that. You have a sort of area that you would cordon off. I think, though, in Canada should set up zones where they look at incubating things like nanotechnology and science and technology in general, healthcare issues. I mean, it would be wonderful to be able to do that and invite people to come and experiment with those. In fact, what's happening in China now, because obviously they don't need to kickstart anything anymore, but what they're doing is several of these special economic zones have now been turned into special environmental zones, where the only thing you can actually invest in would be R&D in things like solar energy, wind energy, all these turbines and so on. So China is way ahead of several of the countries.
I was going to comment on solar. I read an article from one of our Canadian firms called Opal Technology, and they've just landed a couple large contracts. We're talking millions and millions of dollars there on solar, but China has made solar one of its pillars, and it's going to take the pole position. As America did with the car industry, with the Fords at the turn of the last century. China has staked out half a dozen pillars, and one of those is solar power. They're going to become the world's experts on that. And just what
I think you're right. They're doing that. They're converting some of these zones or setting up new zones, little enclaves, where the only thing you can do is to research. And they'll make strategic alliances with Western companies.
And that's what they did with Opal.
Right. So I don't see why that couldn't be done in Canada, to invite people to do that and bring their research talents with them instead. And it could be fun.
The folks watching this are mainly our MBA folks.
They're MBAs who
master students. They're the ones that are the leaders, the C-class executives, the middle management people. It's not Connie and I are those old farts moving along. It's you folks are going to make the
Speak
decision
for
here.
yourself.
Are going to make the decision here, and so you need to follow this closely and understand what competitive advantage they have and the market share they're eating, and should we be competing in the same field? So it's a question for you folks.
There's also that, I said technology, but look at transportation, for instance. I mean, there are several port areas where I think Canada is totally ripe for setting up things like that.
Oh, absolutely.
In logistics.
Well, China's done this intermodal transportation. Everything is seamlessly linked, whether you're coming by port, by air, whatever, it's seamlessly linked. And that's not the case with Canada. We still have silos of the CNR, and it's not sort of as seamlessly linked as it could be. And it needs that.
And I guess that would be the first thing to do, though, because I'm still amazed that there are so many provincial barriers in Canada as well. So maybe joining up within the country first would be a good idea, not just...
Connie, we're close to our time together, but I did want to ask you one other thing. This open sesame, catchy phrase. I remember Alibaba and the 40 thieves and the 40 buckets of oil from youngster days, and could never find the girls. But anyway, share with me what's this Open Sesame organization?
You know, it was it was when I started this recent research, which was about Asian market economies, we really had to give the project a name, because I collaborated with people from different universities, so that there are people from London University and from Scandinavia and from different Asian countries. And instead of sort of always saying it's about and saying this long sentence, I just said it's about Sesame. And I said, because the whole idea is to open up the concept of special economic zones and say what it is and just take the mystery out of that. And it was a conference in Japan in 2009, 2010. And it was just easy. There were so many emails and Skype and so on while we were organizing it, that it was much easier to say it's the Sesame, or tell him I want to talk to him about Sesame. And then everybody would know what that was. So I just find whenever I'm doing a big research project like this, which goes over several years, it's nice to give it a name.
It resonates with me.
Exactly. Thank you.
Well, Connie, we've come to the end of our session. Before we close, I'd like you to share with the viewers, as international business practitioners, as folks going offshore, or going to encounter these, going to interface with these, talk about best practices, or are there questions they should be thinking about? What are the do's and don'ts of getting involved in a very high level? Can you give us just a minute or two on that? And then, of course, they're welcome to read, once again, your book.
Thank you. It's in the library as well. Because it's $140, American bucks. I think it's... Anyway,
well, that's about $2 Canadian.
We can cut that out.
So
I don't know. Yeah. Okay. Do's and don'ts. You know, I used to advise companies that were going to set up in China when I lived in Europe. That was part of my job. And I think some of the most important things to think about right at the beginning, you could think they're quite banal, but the fact is you need to decide, well, given your company, given what it is you're manufacturing or what it is you want to do, which is the right country? Mm-hmm. And if it's China, you've still got to go in and say, well, where in China? Because like I'm saying, it's location, location, location. You've got to make sure that wherever you're going to be established, you can also get your products out of there quickly. Mm-hmm. So that the whole logistics thing, which is fitted into where is the zone placed.
Yep.
So you don't want to be, I know China is actually encouraging people to set up in places like Chengdu and Chongqing and Wuhan. These are all way inside the country, out in the west.
Yeah.
So...
just minerals out there, aren't there?
Yeah, well, that's why I'm saying it depends on your company. If that's your gig, then you're fine out there. But if you want to go and manufacture things, and nowadays you can also sell to the Chinese market, right? That's why I'm saying the definition of SEZs. Yeah. Before you could not sell locally, but now that's allowed as well. So if you want to, you need to look at where in China do you want to be. And there are different kinds of zones, because we're looking at zones that would be administered at a national level. And then there are zones that are only done by the provincial government or even lower, a municipal government. And some of these, so there are quirky things that happen there, is that sometimes, even now, some of the municipal governments are offering things which they're not allowed to offer. So you could be promised, you know, blue sky, and you turn up and you don't get it. Yep. But you can't do anything about it. Because that was never a part of a legal system anyway. Yep. So you need to be careful about things like that. It's a big word. I think also, don't just go for the financial incentives that countries, whether China or any of the other countries, will offer. What you need to look at again is the infrastructure. And if you're looking at the other incentives, then make sure that they've taken account of the WTO rules. Because that, which we mentioned earlier, obviously that is going to, they have given developing countries some time to comply with that rule, and that time is 2015. So they might be offering you these incentives which are linked to certain performances. Well, that will become totally prohibited after 2015. So make sure that you're checking. Another thing I think is important is to pick a country where at least international law is respected.
Mm-hmm.
So even if the local laws and regulations are weak, at least, for instance, they would have signed the International Labour Organization conventions.
Yeah.
And the International Bill of Human Rights. So yeah, and that they are in the WTO, and therefore TRIPS is mandated. TRIPS is the trade-related intellectual property. So that you need to make sure, obviously, if you're going there, wherever, you need to make sure your trademarks are protected, your domain names are protected. In China, it's only by registration, not like a common law country like the UK. England, Canada, you can build that up through the common law, but in China, if it's not registered, then it's not protected. So again, it's making sure that those sort of things. And I think the final point I'd make is to, I said respect international law. What I was getting at there is everybody talks about corporate social responsibility these days. And I'm looking at it as my definition of that is really that it includes human rights. Mm-hmm. And I know in China everything that's a dirty word. Well, it isn't if you're really looking at it as saying it's instead of having NGOs blame and shame your company, right? And you lose your reputation and your trademark, etc. It's that you develop the habit of knowing and showing. So you would know that safety rules in the factories, good air in the factories, the normal things that we do in Canada and everywhere else, that once you're doing that and making sure that you're actually living up to those standards, even if it is not the local law, because that's a human right.
Social obligation, social responsibility, those arguments.
So take those with you and implement them, even if it's not required or mandated locally. And that's because I'm saying you need to be able to know and show rather than sit around and wait for them to come and blame you and shame you in the press, etc. Because there are enough NGOs who are doing that. You've seen the latest with Apple. Yeah, and that's pretty annoying when you have such a wonderful product. That it could be tainted by saying people are dying because they're being poisoned by the liquids that they use to clean the screens and so on. So that I think is an important thing to, and it should apply to your supply chain, not just your own factory, but look at what they're doing in the factories that supply your components.
Walmart's very big into that too.
Yeah, I think that's important.
Good. Well, Connie, just outstanding, much in here. I have to say how pleased, how talented Dr. Carter is. It's nice for her to take time today and join us. Nice to have her as a colleague. But again, I thought it was wonderful that you'd share these backsites, this quick overview of special economic zones. You're going to encounter them, and this is a wonderful opportunity to learn more about them. Again, our book's available, and I thank you for joining this series. Thank you. And thank you, Connie.
Thank you. It was fun, Terry. Thanks.